Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. So this week we have quite an epic rebuild on this S-Works Venge. This is a Peter Sagan 2015 edition. We've got a lot going on with this service. We've got a rear derailleur that's not working at all. We've got some bearing spacers that are incorrectly fitted on the chain set. We've got a rear brake issue that we're going to sort out. We've got some detailing on the steerer tube, including shortening the steerer tube. We've got a little problem with one of the spokes. We've got some cable work going on and a polish and detail. So this is a typical service that we get in through the shop every week, every day, and we just film a service once a week for you here on YouTube. So we checked the chain for stretch. This was a new chain that had actually been put on the bike. Even so, I still check it because I don't know the history of a bike, and a customer may say it's new and actually it's done 1,000 miles already. So just check the stretch of the chain, remove the components that I'm going to actually clean and detail and sort out. This rear derailleur was actually cabled incorrectly, and he thought that the derailleur may be broken, and actually even gave me a spare derailleur to put on this bike, but it was just cabled incorrectly, and we solved that as we did the service. So you can see the components, a lot of them are built up with grease and debris and oils, and we sort that out. There was a spacer missing off of that chain set. There's a preloader on the other side, and actually the spacer was on the wrong side, so we sorted that out when we did the bottom bracket. And you can see here the rear brake, the actual head of the Allen key bolt had rounded off. My Allen key was just turning in there, so there was no way to get that precise and torqued correctly. So I actually undid that and replaced that bolt itself. So that was our first issue that we found. And also this rear brake was completely loose in the frame. The idea is that by tightening that, it will centralize the caliper on the rim of the braking surface of the wheel itself. So I had to address that along the way as well. But it was okay because we were taking the brakes off. We needed to clean and lubricate those. So we're stripping this bike right back to frame. So even the bottle cages are coming off in this instance. And then we're going to detail the frame, polish it all up and get it sorted out nicely. So here we also had a frayed cable on the rear derailleur above the pinch bolt. So frame side of the pinch bolt. Once they go like that, there's no other choice but to replace them. You can actually see how that's grained off along the outer part of the first piece of outer. So that definitely needed replacing. So we get out the cables. We actually also replaced the front derailleur cable, which I'll show you the reason for that on the handlebars as we do the bike. But I always just put a little bit of tubing in there just to help myself put the new cables in through the frame. And you can see here the rear brake was completely corroded off. I think it was the outer that corroded against the cable. I can't imagine this being a galvanized steel cable of this level of bike. That's probably a stainless steel cable, but the outer had corroded against it. So it's only a matter of time before that rear brake, you would pull the handlebar and it wouldn't actually release. It would probably pull on tight but not release. So this is why I changed the front derailleur as well as the rear. You can see how this outer is all kinked and twisted and creased where it goes around the handlebars. They had a very tight route through these handlebars where they then came out here into the shifters themselves. They were quite hard to get back in. I used the old cables to help me route the new outers into the handlebars themselves, and again you can see on the left hand shifter there how that's creased and kinked. So we put new outers in there, and that was the sole reason for also doing the front derailleur cable in this instance. So we did the rear derailleur cable, front derailleur cable, and that corroded rear brake. We never actually replaced the front brake cable. We're always trying to save our customers money where we can. You can see here this is the rear brake, how that out was also creased and rusted. That was life extinct, so we get a new one in there as well. So with this bike, I elected to strip the bike down and to get the handlebar cables through the frame before I actually detailed. But before we did that, we just wanted to shorten this steerer tube, so we just put a little guide marker on there, release this off the bike, get all the bearing out, which we'll clean up as well before we put it all back into the frame. So off comes the handlebars. We put them in our Park Tool guide. We're using the Park Tool carbon blade here, which is not like a normal hacksaw blade. It's more like a file. It's got impregnated with diamond and edges to saw that down nicely, and you can see what a neat job it makes of that sawing down of a steerer tube. You do need the right equipment, especially with a carbon steerer tube. So I also just cleaned up the bearings. It's just good practice really, just to get everything nice and clean before we put everything back together. So I'm just using a little bit of brake cleaner there. It doesn't go through the seals, so with a quick blast the way I've done it there and a quick wipe over, you're not going to spoil those bearings in any way by doing that, because it evaporates off so quick. And again, just clean up the frame as well, the cups that those bearings and the forks and everything sits into nicely. So we'll just make sure that's all right. A little bit of grease on the cups themselves doesn't do any harm. It'll just stop those bearings from sticking to the frame, and also any corrosion coming along through dissimilar metals of carbon against stainless. A little bit of grease on there doesn't go amiss. And then we rebuild up those handlebars there and put on the stem, and you can see that that's all nice now and nice and neat and tidy in that top of that steerer tube. So that's already beginning to tidy up this cockpit. So we get the new cables in. I'm going to put those in before I actually detail the frame in this instance, because I put quite a few cable guides through the frame. I didn't want to lose any of those during the cleaning and processing of the bike itself, so I wanted to get all the cables through to their final positions ready for the components to go back on the frame, so there was no risk of me getting into a bit of a muddle with the cables in any way. Now also the handlebar tape was a little bit messy on the bike, but it didn't really need replacing, so just as part of that cleaning up process of the cockpit and the cabling, I just redid the bar tape, re-pulled it through tight. No need to replace it, just tidy it up, and that's all nice and fresh and will feel a little bit nicer. And there was quite a few bits of electrical tape along the way on them handlebar tapes, so that'll just sort that out. So now with the front chain set, I took note of where these Q rings were set up, because obviously there's holes all the way around those for different setups. I took note of where all those were before we took the Q rings off the bike, and then we get everything into the ultrasonic cleaner that we're going to actually clean. So this is a water soluble degreaser, so it's neat in there straight out of the bottle into the ultrasonic cleaner. It's a 6-litre ultrasonic cleaner, and we wash everything down after it's been through the ultrasonic cleaner, get everything nice and clean before we then start the lubricating process. So you can see here how that front derailleur has come up so nicely. Do the brakes, did the chain set, the chain rings, the front and rear derailleurs, the skewers, even the chain I put through, because although it was a new chain, it's good practice to actually re-lubricate it and clean it all up. And the same with the Q rings, just give those a wash down as well. Even the bottle cages are washed down, things like the cassette, just gets everything nice, everything detailed nicely. You're also able to just check components by washing them down and making sure everything is spot on before you put it back on the bike. So next up, with just a little bit of Loctite on the threaded bolts, the pivots for the jockey wheels themselves. The jockey wheels on this particular group set had ceramic bearings in them. There was actually no need for me to do anything with those jockey wheels. They were spotlessly clean anyway, coming off of the bike. There was absolutely no need to do any work on those. But one thing I do when I am lubricating a derailleur is to lubricate the thumb adjuster. A little bit of copper grease, a little bit of anti-seize on the thread, and then a general purpose grease on the actual thumb adjuster itself. It's amazing how many of those I see where they've seized into a derailleur because they've never been lubricated, and you get a little bit of dissimilar metal corrosion going on there, galvanic corrosion. By just lubricating those before you put them back together makes a huge difference. Lubricate the pivot points. Again, we can feel the difference once I've lubricated pivot points like brakes, derailleurs and so on, and even I'm using a little bit of silicone grease on that slider there. You can feel the difference in these components by the way they actuate just after going through a lubricating process like this. You can really begin to feel the difference in those components from previous to post service. A little bit of copper grease on the bolts that hold the chain set, and a little bit of general purpose grease on this lovely carbon pedal arm here, just to stop the rings ever sticking to those, and it's just nice to get that spot on. So I'll put those back in the position that they were in when I took them apart, and then we will just tighten everything up on that. And I actually torque these up as I go, so that I always like to make sure chain rings and chain sets are in their final position on a bike prior to adjusting everything. So now I've done all the mechanical work, I've got all the new cables through, I've sorted out that steerer tube. Now it's just time to detail the frame. And even this, as you'll watch as we go on here, little subtleties that we do that just make a world of difference to the way a bike presents and the way the bike will ride moving forward. So initially I'm just washing this down. We're using a big softy brush. It's a nice soft nylon brush, much more like almost like a sponge, and then we're using a microfiber towel to dry this off. It's amazing how many microfiber towels we go through with one of these full strip down services. Now this little chain guard here, you can see how deteriorated that little bit of plastic was along there. So I just removed that, cleaned up the frame with a little bit of cleaning solution just to make sure there's no residue on there, and then we just fitted a new chain guard on there. And we actually used a clear one rather than a black, because this was a satin finish black and we didn't want to affect the Specialized logo in any way. And then again on the front here, I've actually extended the length of the rear brake out of there because it actually made full right hand lock quite hard. The outer of the brake cable was holding the steering, so I made that a little bit longer, but took off this tape that they put on here. This was just looked like a little electrical tape. Put one of our little clear vinyl stickers on there just to protect that frame. And again, because there's some subtleties in the design of the paintwork on the frame, we've used clear on those so that you can see those design subtleties. And now we're just going to resin polish the frame. So we're using Auto Glim Super Resin Polish. You can buy that in store with us. We will be bringing that to our online store in the very near future. We're really finalising our online store where you'll be able to get our cables and our frame detailing stickers and the polishes and things that we use throughout the builds of these bikes. So we're just polishing everything up now. So that's the Auto Glim polish on there, and then once that's done, we then also ceramic coat the frame, and that will just protect it from debris really sticking to the frame. So that a lovely spray, it really just make details and things pop out on a bike, but it also protects it from water and debris sticking to the frame. It just makes them so much easier to clean moving on as the bike is used on our British roads, which are always pretty mucky. So a lovely ceramic detail makes a huge difference. And now we wash down the wheels. Now this is a classic example. I always talk about a tactile feel of washing components down. I've mentioned it in other videos. Again, I've washed this down, and through tactilely feeling everything on the wheel, I've noticed this. These are a bladed spoke. They're a straight pull spoke, and they should be pretty flat to the rim itself. But this one is actually 90 degrees twisted. It's turned by 90 degrees, so it's no longer having the aero effect of that blade. So just turn that, make sure that's lined up, and I also just check the alignment of the wheel as well before we put the wheel back on the bike. But it's subtleties like that you don't always notice if you don't necessarily wash the entire bike down and just have a feel, a hand-on visual with the bike as you're washing it down. So we also sorted out that. Next up, we're just going to put this cover that should have been on that bearing that was actually on the wrong side of the bike, and the same on the other side. Get those in the correct order that they should have been. On goes the chain set back on the bike. We torque this up before we put the derailleurs on, so as again it's in its final position for the rebuild of the derailleurs. So on goes the front derailleur. We'll get the derailleurs on, get the gears working. Although I normally don't torque these up, I did torque that fitting because this has a chain catcher on there, that SRAM chain catcher. And actually when that came in, a good example of why we do these services, that was actually about 5mm away from the chain when it was in the low ring. Now with these oval Q rings, one of the negatives of them is you can drop a chain quite regularly. So that chain catcher was quite important for this bike and actually was set up completely wrong. So we sorted that out. Again, this cable, the original cable was routed incorrectly, which was stopping that rear derailleur actuating correctly. So we just rerouted that cable, and with the cleaning and relubricating that derailleur, it was working as perfectly as it ever needs to. So that was a good thing for the customer, because like I say, he even gave us a spare derailleur for that. On goes the rear brake with new pinch bolt on the brake, which we've replaced. So that's, and again, a positive thing moving forward for the bike. On goes the front brake. So we've done the drivetrain, the braking. We'll now put on the wheels once we've done this, and then we can start to adjust everything up and get it absolutely spot on. So we'll adjust the brakes, make sure that they're clearing both sides of the rim correctly. Nip off those cables. You can see I use a little cable guide there so that my cables are all the same length when they're nipped off. So the rear derailleur, you'll see me do that again. Get these back on the frame, a little bit of grease on the bolt holes just to stop those corroding. And on goes that lovely chain onto this lovely Q-ring setup on this bike, and then we can just adjust up the gearing on the bike. So we do a little bit of adjustment here. We did a little bit of low screw adjustment there just to make sure that's seated in the number one, and then also a little bit of B screw adjustment there. That would never have been done from new on this bike, so a little bit of adjustment there that actually enables the bike to grab the cassette nicer so that it changes gear more precisely by adjusting the B screw. And we just check the brakes as well. So you can see this bike is now looking absolutely spot on. So there's very little for us left to do other than to run right the way through the bike with a torque wrench. You can see here these crown bolts are actually loose, and we hadn't touched those prior to this torquing section. So we just adjust everything, torque everything up, make sure everything's torqued correctly. Even pinch bolts have a set torque wrench setting. The pads, the mounts, everything we go through with a torque wrench that we can get to, just to make sure this bike is precise and as accurate and as positive as it can possibly be when it goes out from our service. I really enjoy this sort of work because you just know you're making such a difference to the bike, and it's quite satisfying really. And again, with this rear brake, we did the pinch bolt for the mount itself because it was loose when it came in. So if you're new to the channel, please do subscribe. Do drop a comment about your favourite bike and your A-race bike and servicing experiences you've had with that. There's nothing more that we can do now other than to oil the chain, inflate the tyres. This bike is absolutely ready to go. I'm sure this rider will enjoy their next ride and race. Thanks to the owner of this bike for allowing us to film this for the YouTube. I hope you've enjoyed this video as much as we enjoyed doing the bike. Do hit the notification bell and that'll give you a notification when we upload next week. But in the meantime, thanks for watching and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.